Good afternoon, my name is Beatriz Amorim and this is Connected, a podcast by Nova Economics Club. Today we are going to pay attention to the Four-Day Workweek, so we will start with an historical perspective, then we will move to the evaluation of the pros and cons, and we will finish with where Portugal stands on this matter. To bring us light on the topic, we have here Professor Pedro Martins, which holds a PhD in economics from University of Warwick and is currently a professor at Nova S2E2 and researcher in the field of labor economics and public policy. He is also former professor at Queen Mary University of London and was Secretary of State for Employment between 2011 and 2013. Professor, welcome to our podcast and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
So, starting with a little bit of an evolution of the working hours, in the late 19th century, the average length of the working week was between 55 to 65 hours per week. Then we observed two sharp and identifiable declines in the working week after the First and after the Second World War. However, since 1980s, the 5-day and 8-hour per day work week became the norm among most of the countries, and at the same time we also observed a decrease in the power of trade unions and government intervention in the economy. So even though the nature of work dramatically changed, we haven't observed any change in the hours worked. So my question here is, do you think that we will observe a decrease in the hours worked in the near future? And do you think it is possible to have the 4-day working week as a possibility in the near future, or are the conditions not met yet?
It's a great question. I think at the moment things are very unstable in the economy. Of course, we are recovering from the pandemic. More recently, we have had the war in Ukraine. There are still major shocks in China. So I think it's really difficult to predict what will happen in the near future. But I would guess that it will be unlikely to have major changes in terms of working hours in the near future. At the same time, of course, we have a major change in the world of work, which is about the emergence and growth of remote work. So if I were to guess, I would say that we are not likely to see a major reduction in overall working hours in the near future, but I think this massive experiment that has taken place with the pandemic in terms of the growth of remote work will be here to stay. So we may not move to a model in which we have 4 days per week in which people work, but we may have a model where people still work 5 days, but at least 2, 3 or 4 of those days will be in a remote work setting. So it will be more about the composition of working time and not necessarily about the split between working hours and leisure time.
Okay. So you mentioned the question of the war, and a Portuguese economist, Pedro Gomes, which is also the author of the book Friday is the New Saturday, defended this implementation of this 4-day work week, and he said that it could be a possible solution in the short run for the war and in the long run to this fight against the climate change. So the logic behind this is that by reducing the days worked, we will be able to reduce energy consumption, and this could lead to the reduction in dependence from Russian gas and emissions, carbon emissions. So do you think that this could actually be a solution, and do you think that it should be taken a coordinated action to implement this measure?
Well, I think that if we were to move very abruptly to a model involving 4 days of work per week, that would lead to some form of contraction in the economy, which may have this indirect effect of reducing the needs in terms of oil and gas from Russia. So So to that extent, I would agree. I think moving towards that model would indeed reduce the reliance of most European economies with respect to the natural resources from Russia. However, that would also come at a great cost in terms of economic output and well-being. So I'm not too certain that the terms of the trade-off would be positive. At the same time, of course, I think we need to acknowledge that currently there are many firms that are struggling to recruit and retain their workers. So, of course, this may create the necessary conditions for these firms to offer better salaries and perhaps better working conditions, including in terms of a reduced number of working hours. So in order to keep their workers, many of these firms will have to resort to different working models involving not only a greater reliance in terms of remote work schedules, but also fewer working hours in total. So in that sense, there may be some conditions for some developments towards that model. Personally, I would prefer if such a change would take place in a more decentralized manner. That is not necessarily imposed in the exactly same way for all the firms across the entire economy. In Portugal and in many other countries, we have this process of so-called collective bargaining, where employee representatives bargain with the senior management of different firms so that they agree on working conditions that may be more suitable for each firm or for each sector. I think that approach may be better in terms of a potential implementation of this different working hours model, because it would be more decentralized and it would be more aligned with the needs of different firms. The needs are different, so the models most likely should also be different.
So maybe in your opinion, this like 4-day work week is too radical at the moment?
If it were to be implemented across the board in one go for all the countries at the same time, I fear that it may have more costs than benefits. Some countries would most likely be able to implement that because their economies are doing very well. They perhaps are not so volatile or so dependent on external factors, so they would be able to pursue that. But in other cases, maybe there will be big problems.
Okay, and are you able to identify which countries possibly could?
Well, those where working conditions are already better, where most firms are perhaps already implementing some schemes along these lines, for those countries, the transition towards this model would be much softer. So, for instance, even in Portugal, we've had this transition whereby we moved from 48 hours to 44 hours in 1991, and then in 1996 we moved from 44 to 40 hours. So this was a model that was introduced in terms of the law for all firms in the country at a time when many collective agreements, so those that follow from the bargaining, had already established such working hours. So the transition was much softer because many firms had already implemented fewer working hours, even if the law for the full country was not yet at that level. So because the distance currently in Portugal is still quite big, I fear that to implement that abruptly could have important costs.
Okay, so now let's focus on the costs and on the downside. So, of course, there are several control trials that showed improvements in work-life balance and productivity. However, now let's focus on the costs. There is this measure taking the US state of Utah, in where they redefined the working week for state employees. So basically what they did was they increased the hours worked on Mondays to Thursdays, and then Fridays would be the day off. This showed positive environmental results, which we already talked about, but it also showed a decrease in customer satisfaction. I would also like to add another experiment which was done in Volkswagen in Germany. So the workers, to negotiate and not to go in layoff, they negotiated a decrease in working hours per week to 28.8 hours, and this showed positive outcomes, but it also showed an increase in stress in workers due to varied schedules. So considering this, what precautions should be taken before implementing such a radical measure?
I think this approach involving case studies from specific firms or specific organizations, in the case of the public sector, as you mentioned, are really the best way forward, because we can learn so much from these experiments. Some firms implement it, some do not. We try to make good comparisons between those that do and those that don't, and from that there is a huge amount of learning that can be achieved. And this will give lessons not only for the firms, perhaps also for their competitors that operate in the same industries, and also from a public policy perspective. One can learn a lot about what works and what doesn't. So I think it's better to have more evidence of that type before moving forward in terms of implementing such a change across the board for all firms in a given country. So I think there are useful lessons in those two cases. So for instance, in the first one, which I find really interesting, you have this downside in terms of customer satisfaction. That of course can be much more acceptable, if acceptable is the right word, in the context of the public sector where there is less competition. Right? So if a private firm were to implement that in a market where they are facing severe competition, they would go out of business. So that would be quite bad for them, right? So this may mean that, again, depending on the circumstances, a measure may be better or not so good, and that should be taken into account.
Okay. So about also the importance of these pilot projects. Recently, regarding the government budget, Rui Tavares, which is member of the parliament and president of the political party LIVRE, defended an implementation of a pilot project in around 100 national firms across Portugal and across sectors, and he defended this implementation of this pilot project on a 4-day work week. There are several studies on this area, as we already mentioned, in Iceland, Japan, and also in Spain, and they all presented increases in productivity. So, do you think that the same results, meaning increases in productivity, would be expected in the Portuguese case? And do you think that this could be a possible solution for such a structural problem on our economy, which is low productivity?
I think there's clearly a potential for that to be the case. I also agree that it is very likely that productivity would increase, but here I have in mind productivity as the ratio between the total output and the total number of hours worked. Okay, because there is a reduction in the total hours worked, then it is likely that from this measure productivity would increase. However, the output, the total level of output would be reduced because people would be working fewer hours. Those that they would still be working would be more productive, but there is also the component coming from the fact that people would be working fewer hours. In that sense, the amount of output would be reduced. So again, there is a trade-off. We may face a reduction in GDP, which would have implications in terms of working conditions. Would the employees still be expected to be paid the same salary, the same total salary as before? That would be a big question mark. So, but with respect to the idea of conducting more experimentation in this area, I think it's a great idea. If a government agency were to collect applications from firms that would be interested in participating in this trial, if they were to randomize the assignment to participation, that is, if they were to decide on a random basis which firms would participate, that is, would change their structure and which ones would not, then that would create a perfect condition to measure very accurately what is the impact of this different scheme. We would learn a lot in terms of whatever variable we would be interested, namely productivity, total levels of output, worker satisfaction and well-being, customer satisfaction. I think it would be a great idea. The process would have to be established very carefully. There are lots of issues in terms of the design of such a trial, but it could lead to very interesting evidence that would be extremely relevant from a public policy perspective.
Okay, so evaluating the pros and cons, which you already mentioned, this decrease in output do you think that the pros could outweigh the cons, or Portugal is not ready for this yet, or it would not be ready in the near future?
I suspect that in some firms it would work well, it would work nicely. Perhaps firms that are not being managed very well currently, perhaps this could be a nice nudge to push them towards a different approach. Perhaps they would think about how to increase productivity, given that they would have to make do with a smaller number of working hours. Perhaps employees would revisit their engagement with a firm. Perhaps they would reduce a little bit the number of hours that they spend in lunch breaks or in coffee breaks. So perhaps they would engage differently with their work. And this could lead to an overall similar or even higher level of output. So that productivity would definitely increase and output would not be compromised. So I would not rule it out, but I suspect it would only apply to a subset of those firms. So some firms may indeed benefit from the scheme, others possibly not. And that again takes me back to my earlier point that the introduction of a one-size-fits-all approach may not be the best in this context.
Okay. So I think this was quite a nice discussion, and thank you, Professor, for joining us today. And for the people listening, I hope you enjoyed and stay connected.